I'm here with Scott Dominic Carpenter. He is the author of Paris, Lost and Found, a memoir of love. How are you doing today?
For you.
Excellent. You're like a very inspirational figure. You've written a number of different books. You won the 2021 Midwest bookstore bestseller, French like Moi, a Midwesterner in Paris. And I guess this would be considered the follow-up to that book.
Yeah, I mean, not a direct sequel, but certainly another book in sort of that series about life in Paris.
Definitely. So you went to Paris, like I guess when you were 10 years old. Was that the first time you went there?
Yeah, I was kind of force-fed French from an early age. When you're a kid, you just sort of follow orders from your parents, and I had no choice in that matter. But then we lived in London for a little bit, and then I had a school trip when I went to Paris for the very first time. I have to say, I hated it. I hated everything about French. I hated Paris. I found it dirty. Took a long time for me to kind of come around and begin to love the place.
Definitely reminds me of the famous Simpson episode where like Bart Simpson goes to France. What was it like, that eventually you developed an appreciation for, because obviously you've written a couple books on the subject and you teach French as well, right?
Yeah, right. So, it did turn into a lifelong affliction, I guess. But when, I guess at the time that I was in high school, I started to come around a little bit and enjoyed the language. I've always enjoyed languages, and I think that was the kind of early insertion point for me. And then I came to love the literature, and because of my studies, I had the opportunity to go abroad. And I have to say, even at that point, I didn't care much for Paris. I really spent a lot of time in the provinces. So I lived for a while in the southwest of France and enjoyed that a lot. But Paris is like the bathtub drain, and it generally sucks everything toward it. And after a while, I found myself going there for work and other things. And what really turned the key for me was just people. For me, it's always about people, and it's hard to get to know people in a city like Paris. But once you do, and once you make friends, you're kind of in for life. And that's what happened to me. And I really turned into a great sort of fan of the city. And not sort of the flashy, shiny parts, but the authentic way of living there.
Most definitely. And you have a fascination for the Paris catacombs. Can you talk about what do you enjoy about that part of Paris?
Yeah, so the catacombs that people know are the underground ossuaries. So it's a part where when cemeteries were cleared out of the center of Paris, they stacked bones into that area. So that's a part that people can visit publicly. But there is a vast network of underground tunnels. They're actually old quarries. It's where they pulled the limestone out for building structures like Notre Dame and the Sainte-Chapelle and other buildings in the center of Paris. And those tunnels, like stone galleries, remain, and there are a couple of 100 kilometers of these things. And it's a fascinating way to get down into the heart of the city, into a part that most Parisians never see. And you sort of have this sense that you're kind of in the arteries of the body of the city.
That's really incredible. And you wrote this book mostly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Paris Lost and Found is really a book that is talking initially about loss, what it's like to lose somebody, and then how to rebound from that. So the first loss that I talk about in the book has to do with my wife, who's
Sorry.
slowly dying of Alzheimer's disease. But then it also, as you say, it overlaps with a more general collective loss that everybody suffered, which was the 2 years that were taken out of our lives from COVID. And so I returned to Paris when COVID was still a thing, and I was suffering my own loss. And the city was pretty blighted. It was not the sort of happy-go-lucky, sparkling place that people often think of. And it was a kind of sobering experience at first, but then bit by bit, the city started roaring back to life. And in some ways, I think it saved my life.
That's really cool. What would you say like are the biggest differences between the United States and Paris?
That's a really big question. Um, yeah. Just thinking about people, for example. So I mentioned that it's really hard to get to know people in France. Just the way that social circles operate is different. Americans tend to have, at least at a kind of superficial level, a kind of friendliness and an openness. It might be hard to get to know people really well, deeply, but there's a kind of casual friendship that people have, and that's less common in France. So, for me, it has taken decades really to insert myself pretty deeply, and I've done this in part by like serving on the condo board of my building. So I am one of the few sufferers on the condo board in the Paris condo building. And it's actually pretty fascinating. I have several stories in the book that are revolving around that. Problems in the building. People think about murders in the building, only murders in the building, the series, but we didn't have any murders, but lots of little problems. And that's teaches you a lot about people. It allows you to crack that building open, see all of the small dramas that are going on inside of it. And then it gives you the opportunity to work with a bunch of the locals to try to come to some sort of a solution. So we've got there are many adventures, right? One has to do with a kind of a body that is found in the building that we need to figure out who the culprit is. So it's a sort of a humorous detective story, and another that has to do with kind of a wildlife problem in the building. And so these like connect to all other aspects of life in Paris. And so I use these small personal experiences as a way of opening up the city more generally for readers.
Definitely. One of the things I really appreciate about the book is like the humor involved. And you have like, some of these like, very like, bizarre situations that occur. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, bizarre situations are my specialty, I guess. I think the high wire act of the book is that it is dealing with something very serious with loss and then rebuilding your life, but at the same time, it's pretty funny. And for me, these things are always threaded through together. They're always serious aspects of life, and at the same time, on the flip side, there's something funny going on. And so I try to reflect that in the writing itself. Um, yeah, I mean, sometimes it's silly little things. One of the chapters deals with a banking problem I have, which is when I just want to withdraw a little bit of money, and for that I need to be using a code. But to get the code, it has to go to my phone, but my phone number has changed, and now that my phone number has changed, I can't access my account, and since I can't access my account, I can't update my phone number. And what seems to be a pretty small problem involves several trips to the bank, very animated discussions, I would say, with a series of bankers, and dips into some little tales about French culture in general, all on the road to being able to extract finally the money that I need just to pay for a meal.
Definitely. Being someone from the Midwest, I'm from the Midwest as well. You know, a lot of people from the Midwest don't get the opportunity to go to Paris. Like, what would you say like are the similarities like, of Midwesterners and people who live in Paris?
Yeah. Well, let me start with the differences, right? That in some cases, people would say that Paris and the Midwest would be exact opposites, right? Just at least in terms of the cliched images that we have of these places. So Paris is supposed to be chic and elegant and expensive and sophisticated and romantic, all of these things. Whereas, like in the Midwest, we're supposed to be plain spoken, down to earth, a little simpler lifestyles, things like that. And of course, those are fictions, right? That Paris is not really like that. Midwest is not entirely like that. So one of the things that I see gradually are the kinds of similarities that occur. And of course, the people are the same everywhere. But in both of these books, so the first one that I wrote 4 years ago, French like Moi, and then the new one, Paris Lost and Found, I'm always engaging in comparison to show how the lifestyle in Paris is either similar to or different from what I experience in the Midwest. On the condo board, I was just mentioning that it's hard to get to know people. In the States, I also serve on the condo board or a committee of the condo board. And here, I got to know everybody the very first day. I knew everybody's name. I learned their dog's name. And that was this kind of American openness. And in France, it takes a lot longer. One of the other big differences I see just has to do with well, it's really space and the kind of density of life. So the Midwest has a lot of space, right? So we're all spread out. And in Paris, Paris is one of the most densely populated cities in the world. I mean, it's more densely populated than New York, than London, even Shanghai. There's a lot of human life there. And that means that you're just encountering people in all different walks of life. You look out your window and there are little dramas occurring. You go into the metro, you have these encounters. And so, one of the magical things about Paris is that you're in a city of 11 million people, and yet you have small, anonymous little adventures where something happens on the metro and you have to help somebody out. So I've got a whole story that just revolves around a brief encounter on the metro when I have to help a young woman get this crazy large IKEA style lamp into the metro and out of it. And yet it turns into something quite touching and meaningful. And that's the kind of thing that is harder to have in the Midwest, where I can go whole days without really seeing anybody because I look out my window and somehow the sidewalks are empty. And I go to the grocery store and I like check myself out somehow. And everything is done sort of more remotely and maybe sometimes more easily, but I would say sometimes less interestingly in the Midwest because there are fewer encounters with that crushing sort of populace.
You have like, a nice like body of work, like, looking back on it. And I see like, it's very diverse. Like, you've written like, different articles, you've written for academia. And like, now like, you are like, really getting like, as far as like your recognition as an author, like, creatively, like, what are your thoughts about like, just the journey of being a writer and like, what would be your advice to people who are aspiring to write?
Yeah. So you're right. I've done a lot of different things, and I made the move from academic writing to creative writing, I guess about 10 or 11 years ago now. And it's one of the most important decisions in my life. So my first bit of advice is do it. It's also the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. So be aware that it's not an easy road, but it's also just enormously satisfying. I think, one of the things is that I tend to be pretty naive in some respects, so I always underestimate how difficult things will be. If I think I had had any real view of how hard it is to be a writer, how hard it is to publish and everything, I probably would have given up before I started. So maybe don't look too far to the future. Do the writing because it's something you really want to do and give it your best shot. But the work has to be, I think it has to be satisfying on its own account, right? You have to enjoy doing it. And then if you're able to make it in the publishing game, then that's, all to the good. But maybe be ready for some challenges and disappointments there.
What was one of like the biggest disappointments or challenges along the way with publishing?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a combination of a disappointment and a success. So I my first novel came out in 2013, and I think it was a very good novel, but I had a couple of near misses with very large presses that I think could have done quite well with it. And in some respects, I think I submitted it slightly too early, and so it was finally picked up by a small press, that had relatively small distribution. The book did well, I mean, for a small press and picked up a couple of awards, but it was not the kind of really breakout or breakthrough novel that one might have hoped for. So that was sort of a disappointment. The good news there is that the book is now under option for motion picture. So that's going to breathe some new life into it, and I'm really excited to be part of that process.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. I was going to ask you about that. Like, what is that process like? And like, when could it possibly be in theaters?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know, I can't tell you specifically, but in terms of the process, it's been incredibly exciting for me because I've gotten to work a little bit with the screenwriter that they've hired. And so screenwriting is a whole different kettle of fish, and that's not the kind of thing I have any background in, but it is fascinating to participate in that and be able to give some feedback and input. So I think the screenplay is pretty close to done, and they're going to be casting next year and maybe even shooting toward the end of next year or the beginning of the following year. And then there's a whole editing and distribution process, but probably looking a couple of years out, I think, for before it's in any theaters.
Wow, it sounds like a long process because like that won the Kirkus Best Book in 2013. So
Right.
would you say like, that patience is a big part in how do you like, um
Yeah.
go through that process like, of waiting for things because it seems like, it doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the fact is, I'm also a very impatient person, so that's one of the hardest things. Sometimes I think I've been guilty of submitting things before they're ready. So I think over the years I've grown more patient with that so that I'm holding back and making sure that I've really polished my work as much as possible and gotten input on it from other writers and things like that. So that's very helpful. But it's also a very long sort of cycle to get something through publication. And people see this if they have a piece being published in a literary magazine that the just the review process takes a long time. You submit something and you wait for 4 months, and finally you hear yes or no, and then it takes another 6 months for the thing to come out. Books are even longer, and with this novel, yeah, 2013 is when it came out, so it's what are we, 11 years past that. The book had been optioned three times before this by other smaller production companies. They never really did much with it. They weren't able to pull together their financing, so it came as a great surprise and pleasure when this other production company picked it up, and they've got the resources to make it happen. But as you say, I think patience is a virtue in all of this. So don't expect too much and don't expect it fast. Those are probably discouraging words, but maybe it's realistic.
Being a professor of French and the liberal arts at Carleton College, how do you balance your time, between like, your pursuit of being an author and, your job responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us are doing some version of that, right? That there are relatively few of us who are living off of our writing entirely. And so we've got some sort of a main gig, or maybe it's the side gig that we're doing. I think the biggest challenge is to keep the writing going, right? The temptation is to always kick the can down the road and say, yeah, I'm pretty busy this week. I'll try to write next week. And then the next week comes up and it's like, pretty busy this week. And there's that idea that the urgency of what is needed today always outweighs the longer term project. So I think one needs to be very attentive to that. And I tend to be pretty disciplined so that I make sure that I have time carved out. If I don't put it in my schedule, it doesn't happen, right? If I have a morning open that is unscheduled on my schedule, and somebody says, "Oh, can we have a meeting then? Can you come in for something?" It's like, "Oh, I guess I can. I don't have anything else scheduled." So I actually block out time to to make sure that if somebody tries to take away my writing time, I can say, "Oh, sorry, I have conflict. I have something else going on." That something else is my creative work. For me, it's really important to make sure that I'm giving that pride of place in my schedule.
Definitely. Would you consider this a travel book?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, among other things. I think it's an odd little book. I think it's an uncanny little book. It's a travel book to the extent that it does talk a lot about the city of Paris. In fact, the city of Paris is maybe the main character of the book. At the same time, it's a very personal story that is not based in travel. I mean, it is entangled with travel, but it's not really about travel. But ultimately, I think it's really a book about place, about the interactions between a person and place. So it could be in a sense, about my home, which I guess is in St. Paul. But Paris is also my other home. That's where I have spent for decades. I've gone back and forth. So for me, it doesn't feel as if I'm traveling when I go there. I'm just sort of returning home to one of my two homes. But I'm also trying to make sure that readers get exposed to the particular kind of quirky, lively, fascinating, authentic parts of Paris that I know about. And to that extent, I guess it is a travel book. It's really, that is an opportunity for travel for readers.
The book is like really personal, but it's also really funny. Like, how do you balance those two?
Yeah. That is the big challenge. Not just personal, but also, book dealing with loss. Part of it has to do with just the way that I lived through that period. And through that period, I was dealing with some real personal challenges. But even at the time that I was experiencing that progressive loss, there were funny things that were happening. And part of that, these were things that I was able to enjoy with my wife when she was still able to follow things. And afterwards, it's just, I'm a little bit of a hapless traveler, I think. And so it might be that I'm just able to recount my own haplessness and maybe helplessness in some of these situations without being too self-conscious about it. I do think that sort of tragedy and comedy are two sides of the same coin, and I try to reflect that in my writing as best I can.
What's next for you in your career?
I've got another novel in the works, so I've got a pretty significant start on that. It's also got a French connection to it. And in a sense, looking forward, I'm very busy right now with the book tour for Paris Lost and Found, hitting lots of different areas. In a sense, looking forward to wrapping that part up so that I can jump back into the writing and hope to have that completed within maybe the next 6 months.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time, Scott Carpenter. Au revoir.
Au revoir, Ryan.
Definitely. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thanks so much.